survivors of the Holocaust, and they were part of an unusual group of people who escaped Europe by the virtue of a person named Sugihara.
So I'm here to talk about my parents. They met during the war, unusual circumstances. My parents were unusual people. They were each incredibly focused on Jewish education. They each pursued educations that were unlikely for people from their circumstances. And they each had leadership qualities, each different than the other. And my father, in addition, he had a way of conducting. He just exuded authority. He was a school principal back in the days when kids jumped when the school principal said anything. And he just had a way, policemen would stop traffic for him just about. I mean, he was just a remarkable fellow. And my mom is still alive. She's 94. This picture is, when they're in their mid-late 50s. Of course, both Orthodox Jews. My father was from Germany, my mother was from Poland. My father came from a distinguished family, long lines of rabbis. This is my father's grandfather with his first wife, with whom he had 5 kids. His second wife, that was actually my father's grandmother, who had 2 kids. I just love these pictures for some reason. I always wondered why my great-grandfather was sitting with the first wife and standing with the second. Maybe times changed. But in any case, my father grew up with a large extended family, and they were prosperous, middle-class, prosperous Germans. They were Germans as much as they were Jewish. You can see that this is a picture that could be in any middle-class German family of that era. And in the middle, of course, is my grandfather and my grandmother. And sitting to my grandfather's right, by the way, is his brother, and behind him is his wife, who is the sister of my grandmother.
What year was that?
That was in 1910.
Even before World War I?
Yes, before World War I. And my grandfather, by the way, was a captain in the Kaiser's army. I don't know exactly when, and I don't know how, but I don't think he ever saw a combat. I think he got sick and managed to scoot out, and I couldn't find the picture of my mother's house. But just a sense of the whole family were business people of one sort or another, stores of various sorts. My grandfather was he had a leather goods business. He sold harnesses and reins. He used to travel around the countryside in a horse and buggy. These long week trips, and he and my grandmother, they had 6 children altogether. He was a well-established member of the community. He was an official of the Great Synagogue of Hamburg. And despite the economic turmoil of the time, they clearly seemed to manage well. I remember my father talking about taking a streetcar to buy something, and a million mark note flew out. I mean, they were in hyperinflation in those days. My grandfather eventually gets a car, and my aunt told me that he was a very, even coming home from an exhausting trip, he was always kind and gentle. My father was a bit stiffer than that, I guess. But he also had his ways. So my father attended the Talmud Torah Realschule in Hamburg, which was the predecessor to the modern Hebrew day school. And my father was principal of Maimonides School in Boston. And much of what he molded that school was drawn from that model. So my grandfather died when my father was 18, and in 1931 he had to go to work for a couple of years. He had been going to university. He went part-time. What he wanted to do is he wanted to go to a yeshiva in Poland. That was really a dramatic, a radical step for a young German Jewish guy, but that's what he wanted to do. And my grandmother, despite the economic circumstances and the fact that the whole family thought he was nuts, she backed him. For a while, she's selling cigarettes and chocolates door to door to allow my dad to do this sort of crazy thing. And off he goes, and my grandmother, now Hitler had come to power, my grandmother's left trying to get the rest of her children out of Europe. A whole other story. So my father goes off to Mir, comes from the big city of Hamburg. Mir is a village, there's maybe 1,800 people, and the main business of the town is providing room and board for the yeshiva students. Guys would, maybe like 6 guys would eat at one house, and 4 of them would be sleeping there, and 2 would be sleeping somewhere else, and that's how they lived. They studied very intense, long days of studying, a very fixed schedule. And my father established himself as a scholar. He can study long hours, he's got great insight, and he's a leader and a troublemaker because he's pushing guys who've got the opportunity to bail out. There's trouble coming. This isn't going to be just kind of half bad times like World War I. This is a whole new ballgame. I forgot to mention, when he was back in Hamburg and the Nazis were coming to power and the brown shirts were roaming the streets, and he thought, well, I'll go to Berlin. It's a sophisticated capital. The Nazis aren't going to be running wild over there. He no sooner gets off the train in Berlin, he gets beaten up by brown shirts. At that point, that was it. He was going to Poland. So in any case, the anti-Semitism in Poland, by the way, was a real issue. In the same time frame as the Nazis were passing the Nuremberg laws, keeping Jews from various professions, from owning newspapers, from being doctors, the same thing was happening in Poland. A little different feeling. In Germany it was because the Jews were not even human. In Poland, it was more that the Jews were seen as competing with the Polish people for economic well-being, and also, the religious difference was also a concern. Of all things, in 1938, shortly before Kristallnacht, which I imagine you've heard about, that was a series of events that led to it. The Germans expelled 17,000 Polish Jews, just pushed them over the border. The Poles did not want these Jews at all. They get the bright idea, well, we're going to expel the German Jews out of Poland. That's my father. And a real bright idea. You get my Jew, I'll take your Jew. So my father, I believe he was now sent by the school, but he goes to meet with the leader of the Jewish delegation in the parliament, the Sejm, this guy Mintzberg. They go together to the prime minister to argue against this insane plan. My father takes the plan. Did not, in fact, happen. I think it was just because it was crazy as opposed to that my father was so persuasive. One of the things they were proud of, my father was, as I said, even though he was a tough guy, he was also a do-gooder. This guy at school fell ill with tuberculosis. My father set up a whole thing. He raised money, he sent them to a sanitarium, he organized so that people visited him every week. It said something about my father. Those are the qualities I think that served him well as things went along.
Did they speak German or Yiddish? Or?
My father he came to Poland not knowing Yiddish, but if you speak German, you can get there pretty quick. In the same way, when I grew up speaking Yiddish. When I would travel in Germany in my working years, I would just put a German accent on my Yiddish and I could get away with it. So I guess my dad was doing the same thing in reverse. He never learned Polish, but Jewish communities in Poland were so isolated from their neighbors that for the most part, you could get along without knowing the local language. It was really like a whole separate culture all woven into the country. We'll talk about that a tad more. I just like this picture because I just thought my father was the cockiest looking guy there, and the other was smoking a cigarette. My father smoked a cigarette until literally the day he died.
Correct.
My mother now comes from a different environment. She comes from this little town in Poland. Always makes a point, it's not a shtetl, it's bigger than that, it's a shtot. Not a village, but a town. It's 20,000 people, which is pretty big for the Polish countryside. Again, it's a largely Jewish town. And again, my mother also, long lines of families, long lines of rabbis on both sides of the family. Her father was also ordained, and he was a businessman. He did mortgage broking, he was a grain dealer. Again, hustling for a living. The economy was just terrible in Poland between the wars. And for much of the time, there was a boycott on Jewish businesses, making things even worse. And my grandmother and grandfather had 10 children. And it was just no making a living with 10 children. So he goes off to America when my mother is only 4. He's raising funds for the yeshiva in slum. It's kind of standard. He became an American citizen, and he decided not to bring his family over because he just felt America wasn't a suitable country for pious Jews. And my grandmother, she hustled for a living. She had a bakery, and she made ice cream, and she had a cafe on the town square selling goods to the farmers when they came in on market day. And my grandfather, there wasn't much opportunity for education for Jewish girls. And he was determined that his children know how to read and write Polish, which was, you'd think it was standard, but it wasn't in that environment. And there's my mom over there. And she said, she had it in mind. She wanted to go to the base Yaakov school in Curacao. It was a seminary for girls. It was a new radical program. They educated girls, taught them how to be teachers, and then sent them out to start schools to educate more girls. It was like a pyramid scheme for educating young Jewish women. It's really changing the model, because up at that time, Jewish girls often couldn't read or write Hebrew even. And of course, they weren't learning Polish either. Just to give you an example, my mother's house is actually just out of sight there. My mother's very proud that she had running water in the house. Well, what does running water mean? It doesn't mean a toilet. It meant the pump in a little pump room. That was the running water. Other people didn't even have that. There was an outhouse in the back for the serious stuff. And just to give you a sense of the family, my uncle, he went to America. He's a tall, dignified guy, well-dressed. He goes to America in 1935. My aunt, Rachel, she married this rabbi who was a graduate of the Mir Yeshiva, though he left before my father got there. He was a very famous rabbi in Israel. He's gone now. He was a war hero in the Second World War. He was a prisoner of war in Crete. And then after the war, he was smuggling guns from Egypt for the Haganah, and the British put him in jail. And again, a couple of the brothers, we don't have pictures of most of them. And these are my mother's nephews and nieces. Her sister Fagel, with her husband and 5 children, all lived in one room in my grandmother's house. I mean, people were crowded in those days. It's amazing. We always had this picture of it. It always made my mother sad. But back to my mother's appointment. Goes to the base Yaakov school. She's accepted. She works hard. She's very proud. To this day, she's proud. Until about a year ago, when her health began to fail, she would give speeches 2 or 3 times a year to different girls' schools, talk about this experience, because she's like to us like someone who knew Abraham Lincoln. I mean, it was this school was famous, and the woman that founded it is quite a hero in Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox circles. And in the summertime, they didn't go home in the summer. They went on vacation together. For how long, I don't know. But they'd go to the Carpathian Mountains, and in Poland is the highest of the Carpathians. And they'd be riding wagon rides, and why they're collecting hay, I have no idea. But it was a good life. My mother was very happy. And when she graduated, they sent her to a little town to found the school, and she described how terrified she was. And then there's a whole committee to greet her, and it was a wonderful time for her. She was very, very happy. It was well received. But she wanted to go on to bigger and better things. And she then went on to another town, a larger one. And the funny thing is, she was telling me recently, she said, I should have stayed at that job. It was a good job. They loved me. I loved the children. Well, I don't think my mother ever realized. In my research, I dug up, the next year there was a series, 2 years of ongoing anti-Jewish riots in that town. And then 2 years later come the Germans, and they get there about 4 days after they invaded Poland. So I think my mother just lucked out, heading to take jobs towards the east instead of towards the west. And when she was 22 in 1938, she moves to Slum, back to her hometown. This by now a base Yaakov school. It's well established, it's larger. And my mother's making a few dollars, and my mother likes clothes. To this day, you see my mom, she looks like Nancy Reagan, little, tiny, slender woman, elegantly dressed. And that's her pride and joy. And one of the things I kind of tune into with understanding my mother, working with colleagues was always incredibly important, and I think that's one of the things that pushed her back. As a school where she had other teachers that she could bounce ideas off of. And some of them were lifelong friends. So now here she is, 1938, 39, and things are about to happen. The Germans and the Russians have made a deal in August of 39. They're going to divide up Poland, and Lithuania and Vilna are going to be given to Germany. Thank God that didn't happen, as we'll see soon. But September 1st, war breaks out. The Germans attack. They're bombing all over. They bombed Warsaw, the terror bombing. Poland is overwhelmed in no time. They have a bigger army than the Germans by far. And they're just reeling. People are running in every direction. And on the 17th, the Russian army comes marching in. And 2 days later, they seize Vilna. which Vilna now is, we'll see a map in a moment. Vilna historically was part of Lithuania. In 1920, the Poles captured it and never gave it back. So right now, at this point in time, it's part of Poland, which becomes important soon. The Germans they're not killing Jews in the massive way they did later on when they invaded the next half of Poland, but enough to scare the heck out of people. And I don't really remember the numbers, but hundreds of thousands of Jews are now fleeing eastwards. There's at least 200,000 Jewish refugees in the Russian sector, and it's chaotic, to say the least. And the Russian treatment of these people is part of what creates the problem for these yeshiva guys that I'm going to talk about soon, because they order these people to sign up and become Russian citizens. When you become a Russian citizen, they own you. You can never leave. So people didn't want to do it. Well, if you don't sign up, you send it to Siberia. Well, they sent most of them to Siberia anyway. Well, as terrible as that would seem, 40% of those people that went to Siberia died. But in hindsight, 95% of the people that didn't go to Siberia died. So getting sent to Siberia, as terrible as it seemed to people at the time, was a lifesaver, or a 60% lifesaver in any case. And this train station, actually, my mother passes through later on. So initially, of course, people are thrilled. We've got Russians here instead of Germans dancing in the streets. While living on the Russians turns out to be an insane world. Secret police are spying on people. If you're working in a shop, you drop a wrench, you go to jail. The schools are turned upside down. They're no longer the standard curriculum. It's now a Soviet curriculum. Businesses are confiscated. Jewish leaders are being arrested. And it's just, as my mother said, we were always afraid. It didn't take very long. We were always afraid. Again, we're now in the middle of October, and if you remember the picture, there was a guy on the left, this thing over his head said he had a shortwave radio. He hears in the shortwave radio the Russians are going to turn Vilna over to Lithuania. Lithuania has not been turned over to the Germans. It's still an independent country, and Vilna is going to become part of Lithuania. So the yeshiva guys, they hightail it over to Vilna. Once they get, there's no border there, so they just go in from one part of Russian-occupied Poland to another, but shortly, within 2 weeks, the border basically will jump over them and they'll be out from under Russian control. Sounds like a good deal, and in fact, so they go en masse, and actually, altogether, several thousand yeshiva guys from different schools went, and maybe 15, depends how you count, 15 to 30,000 other Polish Jewish refugees cram into Poland. Now here comes, one of the themes of surviving is guilt. My father, he's this interesting character in the school, been a bit of a troublemaker, and the head of the school calls him as they're about to leave. He says, I want you to stay. My brother-in-law, the chief rabbi of the town, he's elderly, he can't really stay alone. You're German, the Germans won't hurt you, so you stay behind. And my father did stay behind for a day. And he told me years later, he said, the next morning, the whole atmosphere of the town changed, because the town was entirely dominated by the yeshiva, and all they were all doing. He said, the young communists were swaggering in the streets, and I just felt that if I stayed, I would be dead soon. And so he went, I don't know what the ramifications were, but he went and caught up with the rest of the guys.
How far do you think it was from there to Vilnius?
From Slonim to where that house is about 60 miles. So I'm going to guess that it was about 80 to 100 miles to go to Vilna. And they did not, this was not walking, because they weren't, trains and however they went. But it was ordinary transportation. By the time my mother gets to go, it's a whole other story. So here we are in Vilna, the Jewish quarter. It's small, it's crowded. And this is the head of my father's school, Rabbi Eliezer Yehuda Finkel. Now, in this world, the head of the yeshiva, he's like the Pope. I mean, people, he's presumed to be brilliant. What he says is presumed to be right, and people don't dare question him, which is, of course, one of the problems that my father had with him, because my father dared question anybody. But I always kind of wondered whether he asked my father to stay behind because he was German, because there was 30 other German guys, or because it would be nice to get rid of them. Well, let me not go too far into my feelings about this man.
Vilna was essentially a ghetto, I think.
No. It was an open city. It was just not, not wide open boulevards. The Jewish quarter was narrow streets, crowded. This was not it was not an area of confinement. It was just an area of choice, so to speak. As I said, the yeshiva goes there. They first they're crowded into a small space, sleeping on their suitcases. In a few days, they get a bit more space, and they get back to studying. That's their job. They study the Talmud. That's a mission that's understood as a sacred activity in and of itself. The the Lithuanian Jewish community was remarkably opened their arms and opened their kitchens. It was really it was remarkable how well these people were received. And of course, international aid began, and things were reasonable. But the yeshiva world is an intense debate, because a lot of these leading rabbis, they go, let's just sit tight. We're safe here. We'll wait, the war will be over, and then we'll go back and we'll rebuild the Jewish world in Poland. And there's other guys going, are you crazy? So, and we'll get back to this guy soon, our friend Rabbi Finkel. So an important character in all this is Devorah Epelgrad, a wonderful name. He's escaped from Warsaw. He's a Zionist leader. His job in life is to get people into Palestine, which was not easy. The British gave very few visas to get into Palestine. And this guy now, he's now in Vilna after an incredible escape. 11 days on foot with a wife and a baby. And he's like the Energizer Bunny of escaping. And he's everywhere, and he's agitating, and he's contacting all around the world. He's got connections everywhere, and he's working to get people, papers for people, very slow, limited success. And he's also working to get people to face up to reality and not to just sit and wait, but to get yourself a passport. If you can get a visa, it does you no good if you don't have a passport. If you were from Poland, you wouldn't have bothered getting a passport. You never left the country. By the end of 1939, Vilna is now passed over to Lithuania. The borders are starting to close. Where's my mother? My mother's back in Slonim. She's there under Russian rule. The border has now closed, that dotted line that you see. Right over here. So this border is now starting to be guarded. And my mother is down there in Slonim. And the Russians announced after New Year, there's no longer going to be this Shabbat in schools. None of this taken every Saturday off. The school week is going to revolve, so it's a different day off each week. So now my mother, a devout Orthodox woman, this is like overwhelming. She cannot do this. And in any case, the Russians have taken over the school. My mother now, instead of teaching 3rd and 4th grade, she switches to 1st. As the way she said it, she said, at least in the 1st grade, I didn't have to teach them that Stalin was God. That came afterwards. I mean, it's hard to understand what an insane world Stalin's Russia was. So my mother determines she's going to escape. And she goes to her mother. Her mother is too old to go. Her mother blesses her, tells her to go, save yourself. You have the opportunity. I have Fagel with me. Go. Don't worry. Go. And my mother, to this day, is grateful that her mother let her go. I don't know what she would have done if her mother said no. I know other people's parents told them not to go and didn't. My mother takes 2 of her girlfriends, 2 other Beis Yaakov teachers, and she takes her nephew, the oldest of those 5 children. They take the train to Lida, where that little house is. It's like about 60 miles. And then it's something like 30 kilometers, 18 miles, through the woods just to get to the border. To get to Vilna is even further, but just to get to the border. And so they go New Year's Eve. My mother figures she's got a whole day. Nobody will be looking for her. Doesn't tell anybody. She doesn't even tell her brother. And I asked her why, because she's always been so close to her younger brother. She said in those days the walls had ears. She said he wasn't Orthodox. He was flirting with the socialist movements, and she just was afraid he might turn her in. That's what the environment was like. So in any case, they go off to the woods. They're caught, of all things, And my mother's friend Tybala has got a gold coin, and she bribes the guard, and they go on. And I met Tybala in 1960. She, a number of the yeshiva guys, my father, Tybala's husband, they married girls so that the girls could be saved and travel in their papers. They would have civil ceremonies, and that's what my father did later. I'm jumping ahead of myself, in order to be able to save my mother. And what happened to Shlomo? When I asked my mother, because it seemed like his fate, like dropped off the story. All my mother told me years ago, what she said was that in those days, a father didn't wait for his son, and a son didn't wait for his father. Oof. And it was only recently that my mother told me a bit more. We don't exactly know his fate, but we know that he returned to Poland. So my mother, again, just makes it in. She's got, like, 2 weeks later, from what we understand, it would have been impossible to cross the border. Now she's in Vilna, and she's quite happy. This is exciting. She says to me, you would probably like to go to Hollywood and see all the stars walking around. She said, for me, Vilna was like Hollywood. All the great rabbis were all walking the streets. It was like wonderful. She knew all these people. They were like, if there was rabbi cards instead of baseball cards, she would have been collecting them. She knew, and don't forget, she was a graduate of the Yaakov movement, so she knew the daughters of many of these famous rabbis. It was really like heaven for her in a way. And she was doing all right financially. She knew how to knit, and she was knitting sweaters and vests. She was giving classes. So my mother's doing fine in Vilna. So now the first half of the year, 1940. Don't forget the war started September 39. We're now in 1940, and Lithuania is an independent country for a while, although the Russians are poking in more and more. And the debate again is raging in the yeshiva world. We should go, we shouldn't go. We can't send these guys to Palestine because there's not a need for that many rabbis there. These people won't be, they'll fall off into other things. We've got to stay. A million crazy reasons. Not everybody, by the way. But even those who decided to go, there was nowhere to go for the most part. But the yeshiva has to move out of Vilna. They move 80 miles away to the town. And they're studying as usual. And the head of my friend Rabbi Finkel, he comes up with a bright idea. We really should be going. I'll go to Palestine first. And you guys wait here. And when I get to Palestine, I'll make the arrangements and bring you over. And well, I don't know why he didn't know that was insane, but the rest of them knew that was insane. But it's hard to confront this guy. He's a holy man. So they get a couple of guys, they get hold of Devorah Epelgrad, this fiery Energizer bunny. And as Finkel described the scene in a letter he wrote to a rabbi in Palestine, he's giving a lecture, the door bursts open, and this guy shouts out, "Why are you waiting to be killed?" Well, nobody talks to Rabbi Finkel that way, but he caught his attention, and he persuades Finkel, they went to a private room, to have the Polish guys who didn't have passports, have them apply to the Polish legation in the British embassy in Kaunas, at least to have paperwork in case things broke for them. So they went and they did that. So people had paperwork that in fact was invalidated, had to get Lithuania, but at least the beginnings, the mental and the paperwork preparation for escaping. And Varhaftik, by the way, he's now making arrangements with Finkel to head off to Palestine through Turkey. Now comes a wedding. One of the Mir guys gets married in Vilna, and my father goes to the wedding, and my mother, who's a little naive perhaps sometimes, she's there. She's selling magazine subscriptions for the Beis Yaakov system. Right? There isn't one anymore, but she's selling magazine subscriptions. My father spots her. He goes. He walks over. He's bowled over now. He told me years later, he said, it was love at first sight. And my mother would just giggle, and she said, he was just a ticket. Who knows what the truth is? But they stayed in touch. And obviously, despite the distances and the circumstances and the travel restrictions, they managed to have excursions. Nobody ever talked about this as being anything like a date, but somehow yeshiva boys and some of the girls would have these excursions out to the country. There's my dad up there. You see, it says in a very un-rabbinic outfit, paddling a canoe. My father, the guy down below, is a bit more properly dressed for a yeshiva boy. And my mother, by this time, she's in this up in the left. My mother is in Vladisvostok. It's 80 miles from where my father is. This is my father's safe conduct pass in Lithuania. I have not seen another one like this. I don't know why it looks entirely different than other ones I've seen. But this is his registration with some ministry in Lithuania. Later on, the Red Cross registration, because you needed that to be on their list to get food and aid and whatever. And off on the right part of it, you see the next year where he enters my mother, that he's married my mother. And this, on the right, those are all travel authorizations, authorizing him to go to Vilna, where the refugees weren't allowed to go. And why is he doing all that traveling? We'll find out soon. Because don't forget, my mother's not in Vilna, she's the other direction. So now, between May and August, the Jewish hopes in Lithuania down the toilet. The Russians take over. It's a slow thing, but they assume control. They take over. Lithuania is now the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic, no longer the country of Lithuania. Arrests, confiscations, school closing, just like when they turned Poland upside down. However, there's a ray of hope in the same time frame, because early May, this idea of the Curacao visa, that's a notation on your passport that says you can go to Curacao without a visa. And to get out, you need a passport, you need an end destination visa, you need transit for whatever country you're going to cross. Well, suddenly, some kind of end destination is available. I'll leave out the whole back and forth, but on June 22nd, comes July 22nd, this woman goes to, she gets a signature from, she's had her Polish papers signed by the Dutch ambassador in Riga. Then her papers are invalidated, so she goes to this fellow in here we go. Okay, so this guy on the left, he's slowly come along with this idea. He had told her, you don't need a visa to go to Curacao, but you can't enter without the governor's permission. Eventually he agrees to write that on her passport, but leave out the last sentence. So in other words, to make it look like you can go to Curacao, but the part about but you need the governor's permission and he doesn't give it to anybody, that's left out. And now Pesha's got this paper, only it gets invalidated the next day, so she goes to Schwarzendyke. Schwarzendyke, he's the Philips radio representative in Lithuania. The job that he's got as the consul was in May, the guy that had the job, LPJ fired him because he was a Nazi sympathizer. And in June, he puts Schwarzendyke in. So a month ahead of time, out goes the Nazi, in comes this guy, who's not a diplomat whatsoever, but a decent guy. And he gets permission and he signs her thing, yep, makes it look like she's got a place to go. She tells everybody, and over the next 9 days, Schwarzendyke, he writes out, I forgot, something like 23, there's different versions, 2,300 of these notations on people's passports, making it look like they've got somewhere to go. On the 26th, Pesha Levitt and her husband and her mother-in-law and brother-in-law, they go to Sugihara, this Japanese diplomat there in Kaunas. What's he doing in Kaunas? We can talk about that later. He's got to be the only Japanese guy within 1,000 miles. And he looks at their paperwork and it looks legitimate to him and he signs. He gives her a transit visa. So now she's in Fat City. The only thing is she needs permission from the Russians to go, but everything else is in place. And she tells Varhaftik. So on the 27th, there's a mob outside of Sugihara's office. Sugihara's been doing a handful of certificates a day. There's hundreds of Jews out there pleading and begging. So he tells them a delegation of 5 come in and tell me what's going on. Varhaftik, of course, gets in there. explains the thing, and Sugihara is a decent guy, and he considers, and he cables home for instructions, and he only gets back as, you've got to follow procedures. They've got to have a valid place to go. They've got to have money, blah, 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 blah. He cables again because, this isn't quite normal circumstance. And slowly, he gives up on home office. He's not going to get permission. He doesn't, it seems, exactly get told no, but pretty much he's told no. And he starts signing. At first he's signing just the most legitimate ones. By the 10th of August, he's signing anything. But let's go back. So, again, this little, the doors have been closed and suddenly open. One window, another window, 3 windows in a row, and you could run through. And on the 28th and 29th, the Russians, out of the blue, well, 6 months of negotiation, they announced that they're going to give exit visas to these people. This is a remarkable, there's been no hope, and 3 roadblocks open up suddenly. So here we have Sugihara on the left. On the right, we have him with his family. And that guy in the back is Wolfgang Gudzer. Wolfgang is Sugihara's assistant. And one of the first people to show up is a guy from the Mir Yeshiva, my father's school. He's got a stack of 300 passports. Oh, I forgot. They've already sent the guy with the same 300 passports to Schwarzendyke, and he's signed them, all of them. So now that here they are with Sugihara and Gudzer is overwhelmed. He says, "This, we can't handle this. It's very, you'll see what these transit visas look like. It's very laborious writing the stuff in the Japanese." And Zupnik says, "Well, we'll help you." And Sugihara agrees. So there's Zupnik down in the basement with 4 other yeshiva guys in this German, and they're writing for 2 weeks. They're writing. Not just the yeshiva guys, but for other people that are trying to catch up. Well, it's interesting because who's this guy Gudzer? Well, we don't even know who Sugihara is really, but Gudzer turns out to be a Gestapo agent. This doesn't come out till years later. He's been sent by the Germans to keep track of what the heck is Sugihara's doing. True, the Germans and the Japanese are about to form an alliance, but they just are very suspicious of him, and they send someone to keep track of him. Well, he never reports what Sugihara is doing, and at the end of the 2 weeks, when Zupnik says, how can I thank you? He says to him, I've seen this interview, Wolfgang says to him, remember, the world is a wheel, and today Hitler is on the top, and tomorrow he might be on the bottom. Remember what I've done for you. Interesting. But anyway, so Sugihara works like crazy. His wife is not an official, but his relationship with the wife is not typically Japanese. She's very supportive of him. Apparently he's consulted her, and he's cramping like crazy. She's rubbing his arms at night, and they pump out. Well, later he'll have to give a list to Home Office. They want to know what the heck he's been doing. 2,139 names are on that list. But there's a document that the Home Office in Japan Foreign Ministry Office that lists another 3,000 something. So it's all murky, it's unclear, but some huge number of people benefited from his sticking his neck out like that. It's an incredible gesture of decency. And how did he come to do that? Later on, I'd like to talk about him further. It's interesting. And this is the Schwarzendyke up on top. Is number 45 on the left. It's typewritten. And number 41 on the same day, just written by hand. And the later ones are actually stamped and then just signed. And this guy Schwarzendyke, when it was over, when the Russians forced him to close his embassy, his consulate, he burned all his paperwork. He destroyed any evidence of what he had done. He goes back to Holland and waiting for the Gestapo to show up. And actually they did one day, but for something entirely different. And he ended up actually talking about it. And his version of events has got a few details that nobody else's did, so who knows. This is one of the documents in our possession. This is dated August 31st, which seems to be the last day that Sugihara was in Kaunas in Covenant writing these things. This family traveled with my parents on the ship from Japan to San Francisco. And after they died, their grandson brought it to my father.
Isn't that Sugihara's handwriting?
All this stuff here. unless the quote was a forgery, because there's some belief, there's one story that a group of Jesuits took his material after he left, because he didn't destroy it, and produced thousands of forgeries. Who's to know? You'd have to be quite expert to know whether this is really his handwriting, but it's clear that the Japanese, by the way, for the most part, didn't look too closely at all these documents. That comes an issue later on. And here's what the list looks like that he had to submit. My understanding is that this is how it was submitted, as opposed to this being a translation. I don't really know that. But whatever it was, however many people, whether it was forgeries or not, nonetheless, the original ones came from Sugihara and his wife, and they get, in my mind, they get the credit for all of it. Pesha Levitt and her husband, they came on the 26th, and they got numbers 17, 18, and 19. And you can see how few were on the days before. The 26th, the load is building up. There's, I think, 13, then the 26th, and further on the list, then it explodes. All the pieces, it would seem to be in place, except for the Russians, we've said, have agreed to give exit visas. Well, that's not so simple, because the Russians want money, real money, American money. It's not clear. I had always heard there's a death penalty for carrying American money. Others say that no, they just sent it to Siberia, but one way or another, it was dangerous to carry money. And who gets the job? My father. Finkel heads off to Palestine. He gives my father the remaining money that they have. And now the money is raised in different ways. They're selling goods. They're converting funds on the black market into dollars. There's money coming in from America in daily packets. And I've been reading like crazy. I haven't been able to figure out if that was coming in dollars or in local currency that had to be converted. But whatever it is, the months going by, and my dad is converting this money, bringing people in small groups to the Russian secret police. And some accounts will tell you that it's you have to get agreement from the secret police, and then you have to buy tickets for the money from Interest, the Russian travel agency. Well, that's not my understanding, because Interest definitely was staffed by the NKVDs, by the way, the predecessor of the Russian secret police, the predecessor of the KGB. It was all one thing, as I understood it. So anyway, so the money's being raised, the papers are being wrapped up, and the guys are being bunched up in groups of 50 or so, starting in December, and they're heading out. The train from Vilna, 500 miles to Moscow, and then 10 days across to Vladisvostok. I left out. So when my father got this job, my father's he's got chutzpah, I guess. He's a German citizen. He's got his passport with a big J in it. And he goes to the German consulate in Kovna, in Kaunas, and I'm a German citizen. I would like the protection of the embassy should I have difficulty with the Russian police. And he deals with this official, who's a member of the National Party, which was allied with the Nazis. And the guy agreed to help my father. And he gives my father advice. He gives him his private phone number. If you get arrested, call us right away. We'll help you as we can. And my father believes that the man was on the level. He wasn't just pulling his leg, so to speak. And my father asked him why he was helping him. And he said, outside of Germany, he felt an obligation to my father. Inside Germany, other rules apply, as my father remembered, as were other stories. My father liked to tell the light touch stories. Did he have moments of fear and doubt and concern? Yeah. That was my, weren't you worried? Yeah. That was my father's answer to everything. He tells me a story. He gets picked up in a sweep. Not particularly the target, but a whole bunch of people. They're rounded up. They're put into this police station, and the Russians aren't too well organized yet. And my father realizes that the only thing keeping him in there is fear. There's no bars on the window or anything. They're on the first floor. My father jumps out the window, runs away. Nobody else goes because they're terrified of the police. Just the authority of it. Weren't you afraid? And another story he told me was he's on a train. He doesn't have because he couldn't keep his travel papers up to date. He was traveling around too much with the black market stuff and everything. These guys are walking down, checking people's papers, just like in the movies. And my father slowly moseys back the car, and he climbs up between the cars, over the roof, comes down the other side, and goes off into the car that the police had just been in. And again, now my father was incredibly athletic, but nonetheless, it always bowled me over.
About 5 minutes before our break.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, we get to the most exciting part. So my father, now we're now at the end of the year, my father writes to my mother, hurry to Vilna, the yeshiva is starting to move. He marries her in a civil ceremony. They don't live together. On January 3rd, they get married in Vilna. February 1st, they get this translation into English for reasons that my mother doesn't know, but it's too late to ask my father. And in March, they're in Moscow. Why they are in Moscow so late, I have no idea. And they take the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Vladisvostok. It's a 9,000-something mile trip. Where that blue star is garbage on my head. Everyone that took these trips always talks about how at the stops people you'd see, like skeletal people begging for food and stuff. And Vladisvostok, which was a Jewish autonomous republic supposedly, and my mother said, these desperate people that asked them, for food and the extra clothing that they had. And my mother said, no, we didn't have anything. And I forgot to mention for food. My father told me they packed this basket. I never treasured this basket when I was younger. They packed this basket with crackers and heavily salted butter. Apparently, you put enough butter and salt, it doesn't spoil. And in Moscow, my father got these boots, which, if you look in the catalog for Russian Army, knee-high Russian Army, leather Russian Army boots, there are several different styles, but you'll see this exact style. They're still doing them. And I used to love, my father would pull me along in my little sled when I was a kid. And in the Jewish tradition, you don't keep the shoes of someone after they've passed away, at least you don't use them. But I couldn't give them up, and I just kept them. I don't know how much sense it makes, and this we never treasured. I don't know how many years it took before we ever even realized that this wasn't just a piece of junk my mother had, that this had traveled around the world. So one thing I wanted to mention, my father had always told me that when they got to Vladisvostok, the Russians sealed the trains for 24 hours, which made no sense to me. Train after train had already gone. Why would they suddenly have doubts and seal the train? Well, I just found out that on March 5th, something like that, the Japanese sent one of the boatloads of refugees back because the paperwork was no good. And the Russians were outraged because, as far as they were concerned, once these refugees were going, they didn't want them. They were not going to let these people pile up in Vladivostok. And they pressured the Japanese, you take them or this is going to be difficult. So the Japanese went back to closing their eyes to sloppy paperwork. And my only understanding is that it had to be that 24 hours that my father was stuck in the train. And I said to him, were you worried? Ah, God, I miss him, I really do. So then you'd be on this boat, the Amakusa Maru, fairly small boat, took 36 hours. Now, Sugihara was not the only Japanese that was kindly disposed. The Japanese Tourist Board made arrangements with Jewish organizations in America to allow to transport money in for the refugees to help them out. Of course, it was good for the Japanese business because the ship lines would then collect that money for tickets. And this fellow, he had some kind of shtick. He was taking pictures of pretty girls, and he was writing about how these tragic refugees and all that, but also about women of rarely seen beauty. I think today he would have been viewed as a bit odd. And you can see quite the dapper gentleman. And I never thought to measure the distance, but it's longer than the length of Korea. This English language press was very sympathetic, tragedy X faces, smiling with joy, and they were met as a tiny, a 20-member Jewish community in Kobe that mobilized to help these Jews. They were magnificent. They guaranteed money so that the Japanese would allow them to come in. Eventually, they got backed up by the Joint Distribution Committee from America, but at front, they were putting up their own money. Of course, it was 28 cents a day to feed each person. One of the strange incidents comes February. These refugees are hanging around, and Japanese officials are becoming when it was going on. And high naval officials in Tokyo summons, they want to see the leaders of these Jews. And so this delegation gets sent. Amshinover Rebbe is the spokesperson. And my mother, by the way, knows his daughter. And they're brought in front of these Japanese. Setsuzo Kotsuji is interpreting. This guy is into Jews. I don't know if we get a chance to talk about it. And they want to know, why did the Germans hate you? I mean, they're a cultured people. They have to have a reason to hate you like this. And the Amshinover Rebbe, he says, don't read the translated propaganda you're seeing here. Read what they're saying at home. They're talking about an Aryan race, 6 foot tall. You guys are 6 foot tall, blonde, blue eyes, Caucasian. That's not you guys. They're talking about the Jews, the Gypsies, the Slavs, the blacks, the yellows. You guys are the yellows. And when they're done with us, they're coming for you. Well, these officials, I don't know how, if they were just overwhelmed by the chutzpah of it, but whatever it is, it was essentially more or less official Japanese policy not to get swept up by the German anti-Semitism. And again, here's my mother. You can see she's aging over, fairly quickly over these couple of years. And her name used to be Dweira. It was pronounced with a V. And when she became a citizen, she changed it to Devorah. Came on the Kamakura Maru. They left on June 14th. They never knew that on June 5th, the State Department sent word to the consulates all around the world to stop giving visas to refugees that had family living under German and Russian control. Again, they dodged a bullet. They got their papers just in time. They get to San Francisco. My mother goes to New York to live with her brother. My father goes to Cambridge, where his cousin had sponsored him, gets a job, and Saturday nights he takes the train to New York to court my mother. I never could get clear from my mother what her feelings were. I got clear from my father what his feelings were. And they finally got married on November 6th. Here they are. My father was beardless for a while. And so, while it's a triumph, November 6th, but November 9th, that rabbi that my father left behind was killed. And November 14th, my grandmother was killed, my mother's mother. And an eyewitness came, and that's one of the few that we know of for real. And in my research, I found at least the one that she has really seen it. And from what I've seen, I think it's quite possible. And this, of course, is me as a little kid named after that black-bearded guy that you had seen. This was my mother put together this pictures of all of her family. And some of them there aren't any pictures of, but you can see that my mother was fortunate. 2 children were out of Europe when the war started, and 2 survived, my mother and my uncle Simcha, who he was in the Red Army, survived the war, and the rest died and were killed during the war. Unfortunately, the younger one, who my mother describes as not strong, I think, just didn't know how to, he died of starvation after the war. And shall we leave it at that? And then I'd like to talk a bit about Mr. Sugihara and how did he come to be?
So the kids prepared some questions, and I know some, we'll see Sarah's going to be the brave one here and go first, but what I would like you guys to do is, you'll each take one question to start, and then we'll see where it goes from there.
Did your parents have any prized possessions that they kept with them on their travels everywhere?
No, you're seeing there. The Russians confiscated anything that of value when you got to the end. But as far as I could figure out, my parents didn't have anything of value when they got on the train. What my mother had of value was her photographs. That was that was, and a heavy blanket, which was like life-saving in those days. But no jewelry, nothing.
And actually, that's what I would say. I mean, those photographs were remarkable. So if you followed the years, so we talked about, the war starting in 1939. Some of those photographs are from 38, 37, and it was very close to when the war broke out, and they still look like normal, sort of everyday people having a normal life. Okay, who's next?
Since there were so many Jews, why didn't they rebel against the Nazis?
That's sort of the classic question. What one of the survivors said to me was at a camp. He said the guards, they used to be Ukrainian guys, he said they were all giants. We couldn't overpower them. Is that rationalization? Are people just hopeless? I mean, there were escapes, there were revolts in camps. There was every one of these towns I mentioned, there was underground movements. There were people escaping from the ghettos. From the Slundham ghetto, there was an escape. There was an underground. In fact, I mentioned that my grandmother was killed on the 14th. That was in retaliation. The commandant, it's in the records, he sent a message that blaming the Jews for the underground movement. The Jews were stealing weapons from the arsenal in town and smuggling them out of town. So there was resistance, but certainly not to the scale that you'd think, well, there's 3 million, why don't they just rise? Well, you need arms, you need to be together. It's not an easy thing.
Just to continue that, it's so, in those pictures from 1936, 1937, things were happening around, but in those pictures it looked like everybody was kind of comfortable and sort of going about their normal lives. One of the questions that the kids asked in one of the classes is how come they didn't leave before that, or before that?
Two things. One is Jews in Eastern Europe lived through terrible times and survived. People have different expectations. After World War I, hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed between the Russians and the German armies, and life went on. So one is, we can hunker down and get through it. The other thing is there were very limited opportunities. True, we know many people that left, but only some limited number came. My grandfather came over, he became a citizen. Well, not everybody could. He could have brought the rest of his family to Athens, but it's not like the other 10,000, 11,000 Jews in the town would have gotten papers. And it does seem that if you had the initiative and you had the foresight, well, you could go. Well, we know many people that did have the initiative and the foresight, and they got out. But we don't know of the people that had the initiative and the foresight and didn't make it. A book just came out on that subject of people that did all the right things, had all the right resources, and just didn't manage.
Okay, who's next?
Well, you said that there was a big mob of people outside of Mr. Sugihara's house. How long do you think that they would wait to get their papers?
Well, the whole activity, this was on the 27th of July, and on August 31st, it shut down. And you asking, were people staying overnight?
Yeah, were people...
I don't have that impression. I don't know why. My impression is that the crowds gathered again every morning. I don't know why that is, but that's I don't know more than that.
Did they come from just that town, or they came
Well, people came from big distances because this was Kaunas. I've got some of the people came from distances. Now, whether if you were going to be getting back into line, if you went back to Vilna, for instance, it seemed unlikely. It seemed like they'd have to find someplace to crash. But I don't know that.
How did everybody find out that he was signing the papers and everything?
When it was Pesha Levin told Wahavdik, and Wahavdik told the world. He was the energy bunny. He was the broadcaster. Once he like to say, well, a woman found out, everyone. No. Once Wahavdik found out, he literally told everybody. And all the people that were in a position to try to get out were in touch with him, word spread like wildfire. Nowadays we think it's only with the web that word passes.
Tweeted it.
Yeah.
Well, that's some of the equivalent version, maybe it's a little slower.
So what story does this remind you of? Boston area? Somebody who had to spread the word quickly. Paul Revere. It's the same thing. The British are coming. They probably had phones. They probably had some kind of way.
Oh, yeah, no, there was
shortwave radio and that type of thing.
Yeah, we think about that area being so primitive. I mean, there were phones, cars, trucks, buses, the
Trains.
cell phones, of course.
Next. I know you guys wrote some questions down. Ethan?
Was your father or mother arrested any other time besides the time you climbed up
No, they never were. I'll tell you something interesting though. My mother, when I was a little boy, I still remember this. My mother was terrified of policemen. We never talked about this, but I can still remember we sitting on a park bench. I was 4 or 5 years old. A policeman sat next to us. I mean, not bothering us whatsoever. I can still remember he was very clean shaven. And my mother just started to sweat. I could still smell the fear. And she picked me up by the hand and we just ran off. And I think it was just a psychological, like post-traumatic stress kind of thing. She just was overwhelmed by the terror in the moment. I mean, police in Boston were not a threat to me.
The interesting thing about that is that every time an official or an authority figure you came in contact with them, you had no idea whether you were going to get arrested, whether you were going to get beaten, what to admit. So you could just imagine that every time one of those authority figures showed up, it could have meant the end. All right, who's next? Emily?
How did they know to go to Trinity?
It's because word spread quickly that route was opening up. The word that made directions to go. So once this idea of going to Curacao, even if it was phony, came up, then the only way to get there was through Japan, because you couldn't head west because the war had closed off that avenue. So it had to be across Russia to Japan. So once Curacao came, Japan was the only way to go.
And the only person in town.
And the only
person in Lithuania who represented.
And it's amazing. The one guy sitting at that gate was a decent guy. He was Christian. He was not the typical Japanese citizen state. Japan is a nation of obedience and listening to authority. This guy, he defied his father. He didn't go to medical school when he was supposed to. He becomes a diplomat. He moves to Manchuria. He marries a Russian woman. He becomes a Christian. I mean, talk about up to lunch. I mean, beyond expectations. He ends up. She actually divorced him. He comes back. He meets his wife Yukiko, and she married him. She said he was different than other Japanese because he listened to what I had to say. He was just an unusual, decent guy. He couldn't turn his back on people, even if it meant his career, which he ultimately did.
Did anybody actually end up going to Curacao?
No. My understanding is that's what I read. Nobody went to Curacao.
But
There was a Jewish community.
A small one, right? Exactly. It's off the coast of Venezuela. And you could either Curacao or Suriname. I don't know why the Curacao name to describe this stuck. I guess it's just more exotic than Suriname.
How long was the Holocaust? Like how many years were?
If you count it, it's hard to know because scholars kind of get into fine slicing. They'll say, well, September 1st, well, lots of people killed, but that doesn't count as a Holocaust. So maybe you count it when it gets to the really organizing death camps. I don't know. We're talking about several years. Ended in
45.
early 45. Started 42 perhaps. I mean, was when my grandmother was brought to the pit and shot in 1941. I would consider that well into the Holocaust.
Period that we studied, we talked about like life between World War I and World War II, but when the Nazis came to power, it was in 1933. Well, when Hitler came to power, it was 1933, so 1933 to 45, it's about 12 years. So everything that we talked about happened over a period of 12 years, which was, quite a bit of stuff. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Did your parents like make any friends on like this trip? Like.
Well, they traveled with people that had been their friends. Whether they made new friends, I'm not aware. I'm only aware of one conversation that my father had with someone from outside their group, a sailor or a crewman on the boat from Japan. The people, it's interesting, my mother stayed in touch with everybody. My father did not stay in touch with his fellow students. And I always wondered, and I thought maybe it was the guilt that he had left that rabbi behind, that he, not everybody, we tried to help, that he succeed. There was a fight in Japan over the leadership, and I suspect my father must have spoken out there. All I know is that every so often I would meet, somebody would show up, somebody that had been with my father, and it would be Mir Yeshiva, Moses, you saved me. And my father would always brush it off. I think he was uncomfortable with these people. He didn't feel he deserved the gratitude. He did what he had to, saving himself as much as anybody else. And only late in his life did he go to a gathering with large numbers of his fellow students. He did not go out of his way to be in touch. And again, being rescued is it's not a simple thing, because there'll be a whole separate lecture about the mixed feelings and the guilt and the reservations and why me, and it's a complicated business. I was chatting with my mother, maybe it was 40 years after the war or something, and my mother always makes a point of how grateful she is that her mother gave her permission to go. And I was thinking, I said, Ma, we're sitting in the kitchen, my dad's on the other side of the house, and I said that, it's not uncommon for survivors to feel guilt. My father comes running from the other side of the house. I didn't even know he could hear us from his office. He says, she doesn't feel guilty, because if she felt guilty, I would feel guilty. I don't feel guilty. Whoa! I never brought that subject up again. I had not tuned into what, there was an unresolved emotional burden from these events. It wasn't just a simple, heroic, exciting, defy the odds kind of thing. There was a price to be paid in some fashion. I'm not my father's shrink, so I can't really explain more about it, but I know that I myself, I've come to understand there's certain baggage that I carry with this as well. And boy, I got to tell you, preparing this, this was an emotional roller coaster. There were times when I just was becoming so overwhelmed as I was reading and dealing with it and meshed and all this. Thinking, my God, if it wasn't Cousin Marcia who doesn't know me long enough to let me get away with quitting, I gave it a moment to thought. But I'm glad that I did it. I hope you guys have learned a little something, have a little sense of one family's story, of one school's experience.
So just in closing, I want to say one thing, and then I'm going to bring Trevor up. Yaakov, this is the first time that he's actually presented his family story like this. And I asked him how come he hasn't done it before, and he said because nobody's asked him. But hopefully this will be, impetus to share your story, share your parents' story with other groups and other school groups, and maybe with us in the future. But Trevor has a little thing that he wants to say.
To behalf of all of us in our class, we'd like to thank you for telling your story, and we donated some money to the Jewish Collection of Japan
Coalition
for Sugihara.
Oh, that'd be pleasing. Oh, that's very good. I've been thinking about that. During the crisis they're going through, how I have a particular sense of gratitude to them.
So we donated some money in your honor.
Thank you very much. That's a very touching gesture.
She asked me why. I just went on and told her. She asked me why. I just went on and told her. She asked me why. I just went on and told her. She asked me why. I just went on and told her.
That hill, yeah, blow the whistle, find me,